Hello everyone and welcome to Keen Ear. In this video I'm going to be doing quite a bit of Beatles based speculation, and I did think about making this video not just about the Beatles but other artists as well, but I was giving it some thought and actually came to the conclusion that there's enough material here really just to focus just on the Beatles alone, and then maybe I'll make a part 2 where I look at some other artists and other bands and that kind of thing. We'll just keep it Beatles related for this video. And I'm really going to be just focusing really on the what if, very much in this kind of, I guess, 2-part video maybe, or whatever it turns out to be. What if certain things had happened in the music world, if things had music history. What if something that did happen was different? Certain individuals, for instance, gone down a certain different road, and groups have decided to do different things, and things had just kind of changed, things had just panned out differently, and there was a twist of fate here and a change here and that sort of thing. And what I'm going to be focusing on in this video is what if the Beatles had stayed together for at least the course of the 1970s. They'd stayed together for say another 10 years. Now if you're going to kind of do this sort of thing and do this level of sort of speculation, you do have to ignore quite a lot of things. And when it comes to the Beatles staying together, you've got to pretty much ignore the main fact, amongst many other things, which is the fact that the Beatles, didn't want to be together anymore. They didn't want to be Beatles. The Beatles didn't want to be Beatles anymore. So kind of ignore all that kind of stuff and just think, what if it was different? What if the Beatles kind of maybe worked on, the differences that they had, and they kind of maybe were more leaning towards staying together a little bit more than they were, breaking up and that sort of thing. What would have happened, if the Beatles had stayed together throughout the 70s? Now, of course, this is just a lot of speculation. This is just, it's impossible to say for sure. But in terms of music, in terms of the musical style they'd have pretty early on, who knows what they would have been like, in the later part of the 70s, with disco and things like that. Would we have had a Beatles disco record, for instance, and that sort of thing? But in terms of the early period of the 70s, the last album the Beatles worked on together was, Abbey Road. And I'd say with some degree of confidence that if they were to stick together, and if they did stick together, the next album they probably would have worked on would have sounded, I guess, somewhat similar to this. It would have been kind of very, very well produced, quite an accomplished album by, very, at this point, quite experienced musicians. They were still fairly young guys at this point, but they were, more experienced in the studio. They had a lot more tricks up the sleeve, and they had a lot of resources. EMI pretty much would give them anything they wanted, as much studio time as they wanted, and they can kind of do free reign and do what they wanted really in the next project if they decided to do it, and if they did decide to stick together. And yeah, I think it would have been something kind of similar to this, really, in a similar way that Revolver is a kind of similar album in many ways to Rubber Soul, and Magical Mystery Tour, there's material on that which is kind of similar to Sgt. Pepper. And the next album would have been a bit similar. After this though, when you get further and further on, it kind of gets more and more difficult to kind of pinpoint what the Beatles would have sounded like and what they would have been like. I think a follow-up to this would have been kind of similar, in it is kind of the way it's produced and the way it sounds and the way it's put together and that kind of thing. It's kind of, heading that way. And it probably would have had, some of the material, of course, that made its way onto the solo Beatles albums at the time, when they broke up. So stuff like My Sweet Lord and things like that probably would have featured on it, and that kind of thing. And there is actually a fan-made series of albums that exist. They used to be on YouTube. I guess they've been taken down and put back up and taken down repeatedly over the years. I remember listening to some of them, and what they were was solo albums that were, solo songs, from the Beatles that were kind of collected together to create a Beatles album in a way. So you'd have like My Sweet Lord on it, and you'd have maybe Imagine on it, and that kind of thing. An early album from trying to create a compilation really of Beatles material as if they were still together even though they weren't, sort of thing. And yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting kind of idea, really. If you know, and they've got like a 70s one, an early 70s one, and then a later 70s one, and then an 80s one. You know, mixing all the tracks together as if the Beatles, you know, never actually split up in 1970. So yeah, I think that'll be that in terms of sound early on. But you know, who knows for sure what they would have kind of sounded like later on. But in terms of like what we would have, you know, seen the Beatles, the way we would have felt about the Beatles if they would have carried on, I think would have been kind of different to what we appreciate of them now, and what we think of them now. You know, I think the best example of this is with the Rolling Stones. You know, the Rolling Stones are still together to this day. You know, they were around, of course, back in the 70s, and you know, the Rolling Stones now are kind of getting up to 60 years of existence and of being a group together, which is kind of amazing, really. So in the 70s, the Rolling Stones, you know, they were like a very big 60s band as well, just like the Beatles, and you know, they carried on, and they had a lot of, you know, critical acclaim early on. You know, some of their best albums are arguably from the early 70s. You know, they got Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street and things like that. And but as time went on, they were still a good band. They were still creating good music, and they were still kind of, you know, respected, and still had the fans, and they were still great to see live and all this. But as time went on, they kind of lost the relevance. You know, the relevance kind of slipped away. The fan base kind of got older. You know, the mums and dads became, you know, more and more of their fan base as kind of time ticked by, particularly when you started to get to the later 70s and into the 80s. You know, the fan base got older. They weren't as relevant to the young, you know, the youth of the day. They became no longer the, you know, the voice of the youth. You know, the youth sort of population. Basically, they became a group more for the mums and dads than they did for the, you know, for the kids, you know, and that sort of thing, you know, for the boys and girls out there. So yeah, and I think that's kind of similar to what would have happened to the Beatles. They would have carried on, you know, if they'd have carried on, and if they did, they would have still created good music. They still would have been respected. They still would have done very well, I think, and they still would have sold a lot of records. But I think that there would have been a point sometime in the 70s where they kind of just lose the relevance that they had. They'd break apart from, you know, being, you know, the group of the time, and they'd kind of lose that sort of kind of dominance and that kind of importance to a certain extent, because you can't literally keep that going forever. You know, that you know, things change, time moves on, and you know, when the kids in the school start listening to other stuff, and particularly when David Bowie, for instance, starts coming along, and Mark Bolan and Queen and Led Zeppelin, and you know, these groups start to come into, you know, a real force in the 1970s. It's kind of very easy to get pushed to one side, and you know, you see what happened with the Stones. They kind of became a brand almost, and they became like you know, just like this kind of different entity in a way, this sort of thing rather than a group. You know, this kind of machine. They became too much part of the machine, too much part of the, you know, the music industry. You know, too much of a safe seat, really. And yeah, the relevance kind of moved on. I think that's kind of what would have happened to the Beatles. You know, the relevance would have kind of slipped away, and they just wouldn't have had, you know, such a focus on them with the youth of today. You know, they wouldn't have been, you know, there wouldn't have been like Beatlemania in the 70s where they're running around chasing them and that kind of thing. I think that kind of time has kind of moved on, and that was the real relevance that they had, the Beatles at the time, you know, and the Stones, of course, and all the other kind of big artists of that time, and of course later on. But yeah, well, it would have been fascinating to see, you know, the Beatles going head to head with glam rock and David Bowie and Mark Bolan, you know, and T-Rex and that kind of thing, and then, you know, going on maybe arena tours like, you know, Led Zeppelin, you know, and competing with Queen and things like that. You know, it kind of would have been amazing. How would have the Beatles affected, you know, the likes of Queen, the likes of Led Zeppelin? Would they have dominated the scene too much, where they wouldn't have, you know, there wouldn't have been as much space to allow groups like that, or would the Beatles been pushed to one side because of groups? You know, would they have been doing the pushing, or would they been pushed away? You know, sort of thing. You know, it was kind of, you know, two big forces coming together, and there's only going to be one that wins out, and it depends on, you know, many different factors and things like that. But yeah, it would have been fascinating to see, but of course it never really happened. So kind of moving away a little bit from the Beatles for a bit, and you know, let's think about you know, John Lennon. You know, John, you know, he made it to 1980. You know, and he put out this album, Double Fantasy. You know, what would have happened if John had lived, say, for instance, into the 1980s? You know, for another decade. You know, we got another decade out of you know, from John Lennon. You know, what would have the 80s have seen? What would we have seen from the 1980s in terms of, you know, what John would have brought out? And one of the things that's important to note with John and this album is that when this came out, it wasn't, you know, the very moments it came out, really, you know, because John, you know, what happened to John very soon after this came out. But immediately when this came out, this wasn't like a huge thing for a lot of people. You know, it was like, it was a big thing. It wasn't like people were indifferent to it or anything like that. But people were like, okay, there's a new John Lennon album out. There hasn't been one in a while. And it's good to see him back, but you know, that's kind of it, really. You know, it's like, you wonder what he'll do next, and you know, it's not you know, a huge event that happened. And then what happened to John, and it did become a huge event. You know, people kind of couldn't get their hands on a copy of this record quick enough. You know, they'd rush to the record shops to get a copy as soon as they heard what happened. So yeah, this album kind of exploded, but before it exploded and became this big huge thing, it was kind of just, you know, a John Lennon album. He's back into recording and that, and it's good to see him back, and it's interesting to see what he's up to now. And you know, he'd fallen off the radar for so long, and he'd been a bit of an outcast of the music industry and everything. And now he's back, and it's kind of nice to see and that sort of thing. But you know, what would have happened if, you know, if John had lived? You know, what would we have seen throughout the 80s? And you know, listening to this album, it's kind of clear to kind of see, you know, what he would do, at least in terms of his next release and what he'd be working on next. And you know, he's definitely turned more into like you know, a middle of the road kind of star, really, at this point. That's one of the things that you know, the critics said about it. You know, he's kind of found his middle ground, and he's become kind of like very much an artist for your mums and dads and your aunties and uncles, rather than you know, the kids. Again, it's like, it's that relevance thing. I don't think throughout the 80s the big kids rushing out and buying John Lennon records. I think it'd be more like the mums and dads buying the records and that kind of thing. You know, in this album, he's making songs about his family life, you know, his kids and that kind of thing. And you know, at this time he was, you know, he's got a wife, he's got a family, you know, young kids. You know, he's got an ex-wife, you know, and he's heading into kind of middle life, really. He's not really representing the youth necessarily anymore. Of course, there's been, you know, young kids interested in him and that kind of thing, and fans of the Beatles and that sort of thing. They've always been interested in him, but I think he was definitely more catering towards an older generation than he was catering for, you know, with previous, you know, even his earlier solo stuff, which was more towards, you know, kind of a younger crowd, really. This is like him settling down and very much going in that direction. So yeah, I think it would have been the case, really, you know, that's very similar to other solo Beatles experiences, you know, Paul McCartney and George, and that they would have had a pretty quiet decade, really. You know, you see Paul trying to cling to relevance. You know, he's trying to be, you know, hip, and trying to be, you know, at the time, trying to, you know, have it like this typical 80s pop sound. And you know, it's kind of like he's struggling to cling on to relevance. And you got George, who's kind of just, you know, just doing his own thing, really. And you get Ringo kind of losing the plot as well. The 80s were quite a difficult time for the Beatles, really, to say the least. You know, in terms of their musical career, you know, it was you know, they really did struggle to keep momentum, really, and to keep that relevance going. I think it would have been quite tricky for John as well. I think he'd have you know, the next album that came out, you know, this was kind of special because it was the first album he put out in quite a while, but the next one, which I guess probably would have been pretty soon after this, it would have had to have been something special. I know there's an album called Milk and Honey that he put out. You know, it came out, you know, it was extra material that he'd recorded at this time he didn't really finish and that sort of thing. And yeah, you kind of see the pattern really emerging of where he's kind of going, at least early on. Obviously, we don't really know much later on in like the later part of the 80s what he'd get up to. But yeah, I think the relevance, and I think he'd be definitely catering for the you know, the more mums and dads, uncles and aunties sort of age group, rather than for the kids really. And I think he would have had to put out something quite major to really spark a lot of interest. And you see what George did in the late 80s with something like this, and he kind of found a new lease of life. You know, he'd been pretty similar to John in a way, that he'd kind of, you know, a lot of people had just sort of forgotten about him to a certain extent. You know, he wasn't putting out these big albums that were really important, or you must rush out and buy them. And he'd kind of, you know, I wouldn't say lost his way, but he'd kind of, you know, he's kind of been forgotten about. You know, he's kind of been pushed to the corner, sort of thing. And I think if, you know, John needed to pour out something like this, really similar to this, and, you know, become you know, soon after really, you know, the next couple of albums he'd pour out, and, you know, get some, you know, attention and get some like #1 hit and you know, high ranking record, and something that kind of just sets a tone, sets a you know, a mark, and, you know, hits some high points and that kind of thing, breaks some records, and, you know, it's something that's celebrated with the fans and the critics and that kind of thing. And yeah, you know, speaking of you know, George Harrison, be interesting to see what would have happened, of course, if, you know, George was kind of still with us, you know, if he'd have carried on for a bit longer. And you know, I think when it comes to George, I think if he was still around today, we probably would have had maybe 1 record, maybe 2. And he kind of, George was very much, you know, he did what he wanted. If he didn't want to do something at the, you know, the time of his life, you know, the later part of his life, there's no way in hell he could kind of get him to do it. He was the type of guy who would, similar to Prince in many ways, I was thinking about this before, similar to Prince in that if he wanted to be musical, he'd go into his studio. He had a studio in his home. Prince had you know, he had you know, a studio as well that he'd record in, you know, Paisley Park. And, you know, he'd kind of just record, and a lot of times he'd record just for himself. And there's a Prince vault that's apparently got stuff in it from far back as the early 80s, and he just records something and put it in there. And I think George is the same. You know, he'd record something for himself and just kind of leave it. And there's tons and tons of material apparently that's nobody's heard. You know, it's kind of unreleased, you know, unreleased stuff that's in the, you know, George Harrison sort of estate. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the way that George kind of was. He wouldn't kind of be focused on putting out a new record, and that we probably would have got maybe 1, maybe 2, like I said, but I don't think we would have got a whole heap of material, even if he was still around to this day. So that's kind of George Harrison for you, really. So yeah, that's kind of it for this video. You know, it's just speculation really to see what would have happened, you know, if things had been different, you know, and if people were still around. And it's kind of that question, really, you know, when it comes to George and particularly John at the time, you know, because he was still a young guy, you know, when what happened to him, and it was kind of like, you know, you don't really know what you've got till it's gone. It's very much that typical sort of thing, you know. His album came out, you know, Double Fantasy came out. People weren't really that, you know, fussed by it. They went, you know, it was nice to see and that sort of thing, like I mentioned, but it wasn't like this huge event that was mega important. And then, you know, he got murdered, and it did become this huge thing because people had, I thought, you know, dear God, you know, we've lost, you know, we had something and it's gone, and now we've kind of realised that, you know, it's that same old story, really. So yeah, interesting sort of thing, really, interesting sort of series of events, you know, and the way things change and the way you appreciate things. So yeah, I might make a part 2 of this. We'll see how it works out, you know. And if you want to if you want to comment or make your own version of this, or, you know, do a what if of another group, you know, I've got some ideas what I want to do for other artists and that kind of thing. I was going to do it with this video, but, you know, I've only done the Beatles and I'm nearly 20 minutes in, so I didn't want it to be too long. If I'd gone to other artists and started to say what if, you know, things had panned out a bit differently for them, it would be like a 30-minute video and that sort of thing, which is not really what I want to do. So thanks for watching. Yeah, leave a comment if you wish, or make your own response video, or whatever. Don't. It's entirely up to you. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon.